everyone. Welcome back. Today I have Dr. Murray Stein with me again today. I spoke with him a few months ago and talked about some religious ideas, and he gave us his background. And I asked him to come back to talk about a few more things, such as redemption and the afterlife. So some pretty small topics. Before we get started, I'm going to reintroduce Dr. Murray Stein. So he is a graduate of Yale University, the University of Chicago, and the C.G. Jung Institute-Zurich. He is a founding member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. He has been the president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology and the president of the International School of Analytical Psychology-Zurich. His most recent book is The Mystery of Transformation, which is a really good read. I recommend that book to anyone interested in Dr. Stein's work or in Jungian thought. And so we're going to get into it. And then I think if it would be okay with you, sir, could we start? I just wanted to ask, the last time that we talked, you talked about your upbringing and, you know, the upbringing of taking the Bible literally, and if it's not in the Bible, then perhaps it's not worth looking into or thinking about or questioning, and all of your answers are there. And with that, I don't know that this is accurate, but I would assume you grew up with the ideas of heaven and hell and like eternal torment. So I was just curious about when you kind of, I think nowadays they would call it deconstructed, but when you kind of transitioned your faith into making it more personalized, what was it like letting go a lot of that ideas from your upbringing? And was there any like fear involved of what if you're wrong or any type of thing like that?
It's been so long ago that it's hard for me to remember that transition. But I think it was gradual. I don't think it was so abrupt. You know, school has a tremendous effect on us. We're acculturated and brought into modernity in school. And so gradually over a period of time, we're introduced to ideas like evolution and geology and the cosmos, how it's put together, and all of that. That's different from what the Bible describes. And so, I mean, I remember there was a moment when I came home and asked my mother about evolution, and said some kid had mentioned, you know, that we were descended from the monkeys, and she said, well, he may have been, but we weren't. She kind of made a joke of it.
Yeah.
I didn't really fight it. My parents were quite liberal-minded, actually, as I look back on it, and they didn't object to my reading most anything. I mean, they didn't. I read Freud when I was 14 or 15.
Oh.
I got a book, Freud's Interpretation of Dreams, and bought it and brought it home and read it. And I didn't discuss it with them, but I found it very interesting. And then my teachers, you know, were liberal and of this world. And so this introduction into modernity and a different way of thinking about history and all that came on gradually. With regard to the biblical stories and what we have come to call the myths of the Bible, or the fables, I think I rather gradually took on an interest in them as metaphors or examples of how to be in the world, how to be with others, and the miracles in the Bible. Jesus turning the water into wine at the Feast of Cana was seen as a story of Jesus' generosity and his love of the party and wanting to do the right thing in a social setting. So it wasn't the literalness of the miracles weren't emphasized. On my mother's more or less deathbed in her last years, she died in her 70s from Parkinson's and some dementia, so on. I asked her what her favorite part of the Bible was. And she said without hesitation, the epistles of Paul. And I think that's sort of what we grew up with, my sister and I, as children. It was more the values, the ethics, the theological aspects of the Christian faith rather than an emphasis on the miracles. Paul never met Jesus. He hardly refers to the historic Jesus of Nazareth. He refers to Christ, and Christ is a symbol that anyone can respond to. It's not a question of literalism. It's a question of whether you can relate to symbols or not. And Christ is a very powerful symbol for millions of people, whether they believe in the literal miracles of Jesus or not. Of course, you come to a point where you have to commit yourself, for instance, on the resurrection. And that was always the sticking point. Did Jesus really die and come back to life in a resurrected body, and his body disappear from the tomb? Maybe I mentioned last time when I was in Israel, there is a place in the church of the, what is it called? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where, according to tradition, Jesus was buried, and there is a hole in the ground that you can observe and look at, and that's supposedly where Jesus' body was placed, and where the resurrection took place. And I was there with a Jewish friend, analyst friend of mine in Israel, and I said, that's where the body was, and that's where it couldn't be found on Easter Sunday morning. It had disappeared. And he didn't say anything. He just smiled at me. You really believe that? I don't know if I do or not. I believe something important happened there that was very transformative for the people who had been following Jesus, that the literal was transformed into something symbolic and went up into heaven. But, there is in Paul, too, this literal belief that the dead will rise from their tombs in the second coming, and all of that. So I guess I just transitioned to seeing all that as a symbol and metaphor, and you take it in the now, in the present, as a living symbol, as Jung called it. A living symbol is something that speaks to you, that touches you, that you, in the presence of a symbol, you have a numinous experience. It gives you an emotional charge or effect. And I must say, the stories in the Bible about Jesus and others can still have that effect on me. So it's still a living symbol. So the transition, I think, was gradual and cultural. And by the time I got to divinity school, I was 21 years old and went to Yale Divinity School from college. And nobody at the divinity school would have said that they believed anything literal about the Bible.
Oh, really?
At Yale Divinity School, very liberal. It was social action oriented. The man who taught preaching, Bill Meal was his name, a great preacher. And I remember he preached a sermon one Easter Sunday morning, and he called Easter the Great Escape. He said it's a cheap release from suffering. And people take it too quickly and too easily to escape from the suffering of Friday. We should stay with Friday longer and not jump so quickly to Easter. That was his sermon.
Oh, interesting.
So that's what I got in divinity school, very liberal theology, and even though we read Karl Barth, but Karl Barth was a very influential theologian in the 20th century as creator of what was called neo-orthodoxy. I don't think in his heart of hearts he had a literal belief in the Bible either. He was a kind of tricky fellow. He wanted to have it both ways, to say it as though it were literally true, but knowing that it was in a type of language or language game, as some philosophers have called it, a language game, that if you get into that game, everything makes sense within that context. It's a whole world put together. That's how myths operate. Once you get into them, all the pieces make perfect sense, and the thinkers who think about those pieces. But if you step out of that game and look at it from the outside, if you look at any religion from the outside and study it as a scholar, it looks like myth. It looks like people have just fabricated this. They've made this up. They want to believe in it. And so it no longer speaks to you as a symbol. So what we learned at divinity school was if you want to participate in Christianity as a minister, and maybe half the students there were preparing for the ministry, the other half would do other things. But if you want to participate in Christianity as a minister, you have to get inside the game and play by the rules of the game. And that's difficult in a way in the modern world, because on Sunday you're in that game, but on Monday you're in a secular world, which is a very different type of game. It's very materialistic, very rational, scientific materialism. So you operate one way in the world and another way in the religious context. And it's a kind of schizophrenia, actually. It's very hard to bring those two together. Some theologians have tried, like Paul Tillich, I think. But Paul Tillich was a theologian, modern theologian, who felt very strongly that the gospel could address modern questions with answers, but they were all at the level of symbol and meaning. That modern man was deprived of meaningful symbols, and Christianity has symbols to offer. And so I heard him preach also at Battelle Chapel at Yale, and he preached a very powerful sermon in which he said, what the gospel teaches us is that you are accepted. Accept that you are accepted. He said, accept that you are accepted. And this, so his notion about the meaning of the gospel was psychological. It's about self-acceptance, about acceptance that you are a valuable person. It addresses your feelings of guilt and remorse and unworthiness, low self-esteem, and all of that. It raises you up in this feeling of grace. That's a very psychological approach. That was Paul Tillich. So I sort of gravitated in that direction. And then I discovered you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. You spoke of the Christ symbol. Can you kind of explain the difference between like Jesus and Christ?
Well, the word Christ means Messiah.
Hmm.
So when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And one said, "Oh, they say you're Elijah." Another one said, "Oh, you're a prophet. But who do you say that I am?" And then came that great moment where they said, "You are the Christ." That's how we see you. You are the Messiah. Now, what is the Messiah? The Messiah is the promised Redeemer of the world. The notion that a Messiah would come and bring justice into the world and bring peace into the world, that it would be a very powerful force for goodness in the world, would put evil in its place, put it down. All of that was prophesied in the Old Testament and other eschatological literature that was very prevalent just before the time of Jesus. So what they recognized in Jesus was the fulfillment of this prophecy, that this man who has come, this is the Messiah. Now, that isn't how the Messiah was expected to come. The Messiah was expected to come as an all-powerful king and ruler, but Jesus was an ordinary man, the son of a carpenter. He was not of the upper classes. He was born in Bethlehem, which was nowhere, and so to recognize this man as the Messiah was pretty extraordinary. But there was something extraordinary about this man, or he wouldn't have captured that. We say projection, that vision in the people around him when they looked at him, heard him, that there was something so special about him that he could be called the Messiah, the Christ. That there was something there, a very special quality in this man. And when the scholars have studied the New Testament, and this was the new quest for the historical Jesus, and it was very active in the 80s, 90s, maybe even a little earlier. It started with Albert Schweitzer, the quest for the historical Jesus, in the beginning of the century, and then took off in a second wave. And they went through the texts, and line by line, did Jesus say this, yes or no? Did the historical Jesus say this line, these words, yes or no? And they sifted them out by some criteria. I don't know what their criteria were, but does it make sense that he would have said this, that he could have possibly said this? So they sorted it out, and they finally boiled it down to, a few sayings that maybe he said. And you can't even be sure of that. So what we have in the Bible is a construction in retrospect. So the Gospels were written maybe 30, 40, 50 years after Jesus died. Paul's epistles were written before that. Paul's epistles are the earliest part of the New Testament, and then the Gospels came later. And Luke, who wrote the book of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts together, was not even a Jew. He was a Greek. He never met Jesus. He traveled with Paul, and when they went to Jerusalem together, he collected a lot of stories that were being passed around about Jesus, and there were some early documents called the Quella, the Q document, that was being circulated. That's the background of the early Gospels like Mark. And he stitched that all together, and he created this beautiful masterpiece, the Gospel of Luke. It's a great work of art. And the book of Acts, which is the story of Paul and the missionary activities in the early church. And it's a very interesting story. But neither Paul nor Luke ever met Jesus of Nazareth, but they testify that he was the Messiah, that he was the Christ. So why do they do that? And this was something that Jung wondered about. What was it? Why did this man, born of a nobody, a young girl in Israel, take on such a huge symbolic value in the first centuries of Common Era. And he said it was because there had been predictions of the Messiah, so the people were prepared to recognize something like the Messiah.
Uh-huh.
And when they found this figure and the testimonies about him from the apostles, especially Paul, who had the vision of Christ, came to him in a flash, and he was so persuasive that it caught fire. And so they all, in the next generation, started seeing Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. And the man more or less disappeared. All the stories about the man are also very interesting, but they're very fragmented. We don't know anything about his childhood, really, his early years, very, very little. And then from the age of 30 to 33, these extraordinary moments where he's teaching and performing miracles and so on. And then his death and resurrection, that's about it. But a lot of, as we say, archetypal projection was pinned on to that historical figure. And it held for 2,000 years. It's still going. And Jung wondered why. And he relates that to astrology in the age of Pisces. And that it was a part of a shift from the age of Aries, which was the god Aries, to the age of Pisces, the two fish swimming in opposite directions. And so Jung wrote a whole book about this, Ion, his interpretation of the age of Christianity, 2,000 years from the birth of Christ to the present time. And what is Christ? Well, Christ was the God figure. Christ was the central archetypal image of the culture, the God image of the culture. And the Father God in the background, the Creator God, was a part of the picture, and the Holy Spirit was a part of the picture. So you have three figures in the Trinity. But the central figure, the one we know the most about, we're the closest to, have the stories and the image, is the human figure. God became man and then returned to heaven as the Christ figure after the resurrection. And that God becoming man is somewhat unique in mythological history. It does happen occasionally, but not to this degree. The pharaohs were divine. They were incarnations of the sun god Re, and when they died, they returned to the solar bark, and so on. But they were nothing like Jesus. They were not redeemers. They were rulers. They were kings, and they were confined to a particular class. They had to be born from a pharaoh to become a pharaoh. Well, Jesus is born from a virgin, and a carpenter father, a Holy Spirit. A strange story, virgin birth, but that made him very special. That story sets Jesus apart from ordinary human beings, but he's still a human being. He's born of a human. And so he's similar to the pharaohs, but importantly different in that he's a teacher and a savior figure. And pharaohs weren't anything like that. They were rulers.
Yeah, thank you. That nicely segues into one of my other questions, which was that has to do with redemption. So a lot of, especially in the West, we hold to like the penal substitution theory of atonement, to where Christ came because mankind was fallen, and he came to redeem us, and that we cannot make it to heaven or to God of our own accord because we're separate, and so we can make it through Christ. And he's the purpose of him dying and resurrecting was for mankind's redemption. What do you, I guess, make of that idea of redemption?
That's deeply Christian, especially Protestant. And, when God created man in his own image, he created man and woman. They were pure creatures. They were without sin. They were without guilt. They were without history. They lived in paradise. And then there was the fall, when they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, realized that they were naked. They were put out of the garden. And ever since, the consequence has been that we are born into sin, we live in sin, and we will die in sin unless we are, quotes, redeemed. That means bought back, made pure again. Okay. And so Calvin, for instance, was very big on this topic, and the Protestant reformers, this was absolutely central to their teaching, that we are hopeless creatures and without any worth or value unless we are redeemed by Christ. And it's a question that I asked. I remember asking this to some professors. Why is it that some people can believe and others can't? Because if you can't, then you're condemned for ever. Why does God make it possible for some people to be redeemed and other people apparently not? That's not fair. Calvin would say that's up to God. That's God's. In God's wisdom, he has chosen some people to be redeemed, and he's leaving the others to fare for themselves. So it was in the mystery of God's wisdom that if you were redeemed, that is, if you had the experience of redemption, and what I grew up with was this experience was very important, that you had to be born again. And that's an emotional, psychological experience of being convicted of sin and then feeling the presence of grace, and you're born again, and then you're baptized, and now you're all set up for a good life. So in a way, you have to be convinced that you're sinful to begin with. And a lot of preaching was about that, to convict people of their sin. So you get hellfire and brimstone, and what a sorry lot we are, and you are. And once people are convicted of their sin and know it's hopeless, they're helpless. They hit bottom, as they say in AA. You've got to hit bottom before you can start the new life process. You have to be convicted of sin. Now, in the modern world, people don't necessarily believe that. If you go out and take a survey among people here in Switzerland, are you sinful? How bad are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Oh, I'm about a 5 or a 6. I'm not perfect, but I'm okay. And I married a woman who I was astonished when she said, well, I'm a pagan. I believe that everybody's good. We're all born good. There's nothing wrong with babies. Babies are pure. They're innocent. What? I said, no. We're all fallen creatures. So I grew up with that idea. But it's not widely shared anymore. So it's getting to be a harder and harder sell to convince people that they need redemption. Especially among educated people, and let's say among modern, sophisticated people. Maybe in your part of the country, out in the countryside, it's an easier sell. I don't know. But in psychoanalysis, it's interesting. We discover that people have this dark side. People are not whole and perfect and innocent. They have what we call the shadow. And you discover that very quickly in analysis. You know, if you go into analysis, you start introspecting, telling your story, looking at your dreams, you find yourself in a situation of maybe some types of guilt that you hadn't really looked at carefully enough. You swept under the rug. You know, you're repressed. You're certain things you say and think and do, and that comes out. What do you do with it then? Well, the analyst can't redeem you. The analyst doesn't have that power of grace that a priest has. You know, in the Catholic Church, you confess your sins, and then the priest can forgive your sins, and you say a rosary, and you go on.
Yeah.
But the analyst can't do that. So what do? We just sit with it, and we say it's a part of your wholeness. Your shadow is a part of who you are. And we don't want to repress it. We want to look at it, and we want to keep it conscious. You have a better chance of not doing evil if you know your propensity to do evil. You can catch it and maybe make a decision not to enact it. You know, you can do better if you know about your shadow. So we value the shadow as a part of consciousness. We want to make it conscious. We don't want to make people feel guilty necessarily, but we want to make them know themselves. We want to help them know themselves. And knowing about the shadow is a part of that. So how do they get over that feeling of guilt and remorse? I think, what Jung proposed was that there is a possibility through inner work to arrive at a position where you can objectively observe yourself, your good and your evil, your bad, and accept it as a part of the whole. But come to this point that Tillich talked about, accept that you are accepted by something else, that the ego can't do this. And there Jung is like the Protestant theologians. Luther says we can't save ourselves, we need grace from somewhere else. And Jung would say the same thing. We need that transcendent source of acceptance or grace that comes from beyond the ego. Self-acceptance isn't something that you can effectively just do with your ego. That has to come from a deeper level of yourself. It has to come from the self, as he said. And so it's a kind of version of redemption that Jung proposed that arrives from the transcendence within the psyche. Now, whether that links to a transcendence outside the psyche, he left as an open question. I think he thought it did, but he couldn't say that as a scientist, as a psychologist. But I think there is a kind of redemption effect, let's say, in the process of analysis. But it doesn't necessarily make you feel perfect again or clean again, totally. But it does help to balance out knowledge of the shadow with knowledge of other parts and the feeling that it all belongs to the whole, and it's that the whole is good. That's the way I look on this question of redemption in psychology, anyway.
Would Jung say that So how you said you have to feel the self-acceptance from the self, like the ego can't do that for you. For Christians who take that approach and they feel the guilt and they feel the guilt and they're exposed to their shadow, let's say, and then they, through Christ, the symbol, and if Christ and Jungian thought represents the self, is it basically the Christian idea of accepting Christ and then feeling redeemed and accepted? Is that symbol serve the purpose of bridging the gap so the self, you feel the acceptance from the self instead of from the ego? Does that make sense?
Well, that's a very difficult topic. Jung wrestled with that mightily. Is Christ a symbol of the self? He said yes, but not a complete symbol of the self. It's a partial symbol of the self. It symbolizes one side of the self, or one aspect of the self, the goodness, the love, all the positive things that Christ represents. But he said there's something missing, because the self also has another side, and that is represented by the Antichrist. So, Christ, there's Christ and the Antichrist in Christian, let's call it myth. They're brothers. And Christ has a hard time accepting the Antichrist, or what do you do with the Antichrist? And what Jung tried to do was create a symbol, or find a symbol that would include both of them in a larger whole that he called the quaternity. And so that union of the opposites to create a full symbol of the self, he said, would be the task for the next age, the age of Aquarius. In the age of Pisces, you have this strong and very sharp contradiction between Christ and Antichrist. It's really irreconcilable opposites. But in the age of Aquarius, which is a different era of wholeness and reconciliation of the opposites, there would be the possibility of combining them in a larger picture that would contain both of them.
Okay.
So you could say, and Paul Tillich talked about this too, God beyond God. We have a concept of God. When we say God and Christ, know that these are images and ideas that we have, and concepts. What is beyond our concepts? Is there something even greater than our biggest concept? We can't think God all the way. It's too big. So we get pieces. And so then that's a kind of leap of faith to the other side of the wall, where the opposites are united in God. And everything is reconciled ultimately in the God beyond God. But that's such a mystery, we can't think anyway.
Yeah. I know Jung also talked about God, or the God image. He talked about the quaternity, and he talked about God not only being all good, but God was also evil, or the God image also represented evil. And he gave an example of, like the prayer, lead us not into temptation, and he talked about God's evil side as well. Is that, I wanted to know more about that thought, and is it more of like Christians don't even believe that God has the capacity for evil, and he does, it's just restrained? Or would he say that God also enacted evil?
Well, and that gets to the point of what is evil.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote a introduction to a book that I edited, made a collection of things that Jung said about evil. And it's called Jung on Evil, and I wrote an introduction.
Okay.
And I looked pretty carefully at it, and it's always hard to pin Jung down, but basically he says that evil is a category of judgment. Good and evil are judgments that we make based on various assumptions or preferences. And so what is evil to you may not be evil to me. For instance, in this war in the Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, if you go into Russia and listen to their point of view, they are fighting for good. They believe that they're fighting for good values, for Christian values, that they're upholding the highest values of Christianity by opposing the West. The West they see as evil and corrupt. And what they look at is the materialism, the vice, all the rampant sexuality, LGBT, all the rest of that they put under the category of evil. That's a judgment that they make. Well, when we look at Russia and what they're doing at Ukraine, we say they're evil because they are killing innocent people. They're torturing them. They're bombing hospitals and churches and schools. It's horrible what they're doing. That's evil. That's our judgment of them. So you step back and you say, what's evil? Well, it's a judgment. And from another perspective, you could say from a God perspective, maybe nothing is evil and nothing is good. Maybe there is no difference between good and evil. Nietzsche wrote, but beyond good and evil. Is there a position or a standpoint that can look upon anything, everything that happens as just so? This is it. This is nature. This is what happens, given the makeup of the players in the game and nature. What's happening in nature now with global warming. Human beings are being considered evil because they're depleting nature of its resources. They're destroying the natural environment. Other species are going extinct because of human beings. Human beings can be seen as a plague on the planet. So some people judge human beings as evil. But if you look at human beings in another way, and all the wonderful things that they've created, and the culture, and the art, and technology, and all of that, it's amazing what human beings have done. So it's hard to judge. But it may just be that's the way things are set up, and that's the way it's evolving, and we don't know the outcome of all this. Maybe there's something going on in a bigger picture than we realize, that we'll see this as part of history, just part of what happens in the course of the interactions between humans and other species and nature. So the question of how do you judge good and evil, it depends very much on where you stand, what your values are. In politics, it's rampant, our side is good, your side is evil. Anything your side does is evil. No matter what you do, it's evil, it's bad. No matter what our side does, it's good. Well, that's crazy. That's a distortion based on kind of mob mentality. So if you can step outside of that, which some people try to do, and say, well, this is pretty good about what this party does, and that's pretty good or pretty bad what that one does, and you can kind of differentiate a bit, you kind of rise above that level of judgment. But there are times when you have to make a judgment, are you on this side or that side? And Switzerland tries to be neutral, but it's impossible in certain situations, like with Ukraine. They cannot be neutral about that. They have to take sides, and they have taken sides. Maybe not as extremely as England or America, but when you see what's happening there, you just have to choose. That's the existential quandary. What do you choose? Choose this day. Choose good. Don't choose bad, says Moses to his people.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Daniel, so if you want to throw one more on the table.
Okay. Last question. After our last conversation, we spoke offline for a moment and then I lost internet connection, but I wanted to ask, when it comes to the afterlife, I know none of us has ever been there, but when it comes to how you maybe, Carl Jung, I know that he said that it was healthy, like for your psyche, it was psychological healthy to believe in the afterlife. And I wonder what you think of the afterlife from maybe both a psychological perspective and just, all around.
Jung was asked late in life, do you believe in God? By an interviewer from the BBC. And he said, stumbled for a little while, and then he said, well, I've always had a difficult time believing. I don't believe, I know. I have to know based on experience. So I'm sort of in line with that. I can't say I believe in the afterlife. I have ideas, I have thoughts. One idea is that we're made of 3 parts, body, soul, and spirit. The body will go back to its chemical base, and the spirit and soul will remain and go into another space. That's a thought. I can't say I necessarily believe in it, but I think about it. But the strange thing is I've had experiences, we call them synchronicities, around death, when people have died, that were so amazing that I can't really, those are facts. That the Jung would say, what are the facts? Okay. The fact is, this happened and then this happened. And it was as though, and it was very convincing, the spirit of the dead person reappeared as, in one case it was a butterfly, in another case it was birds. And I've talked to people about this, and they say, have you had any experiences like this? And I hear so many stories like that. And also dreams. I worked with a woman in analysis for a couple of years whose daughter died in a tragic automobile accident. She was an only child, 16 years old. And when we sat together in analysis and she brought me her dreams, there were a lot of dreams about her daughter. And of course she was in deep grief and mourning, and it was a total trauma for her and her family. And the dreams tended to fall into 2 categories. One was their remembrance dreams. This is how she was when she was 3 years old, and we were doing such and such, and we were going here and there. And then there were other dreams that were like visitations. In one, I remember the girl in the dream came through a wall and spoke to her mother and told her what she was doing on the other side of the wall.
Oh,
she
cool.
was going to school, and she was continuing to advance in her education. And these dreams, the mother took, although she was a very, very rational businesswoman, Jewish. I mean, she had no belief in the afterlife whatsoever when we started out, but she took those as consoling visitations. So partly it was healing for her. It had a practical effect. And I went along with her completely because it really helped her get through this terrible trauma and move on in her life. Though she could never put that behind her. But it also convinced me in the presence of our dear friends, at least in our psyches, but probably more in even beyond our psyches. So between the synchronicities and the dreams, and I've had some dreams like that about deceased friends and so on, that are just so convincing that they're okay, that they're doing well. I like to think that, and I, because of these facts, I tend to lean in the direction, let's say, of deeply feeling or believing there is an afterlife. What it is, how it is, I don't know. When Dante made his journey, he saw the deceased in 3 levels, the inferno, where they were suffering forever and would never get out of there, and the purgatorio, which had hope, and they were advancing to the paradiso, and then the paradiso, the heavenly realms, and it's very convincing if you read that. I was deeply moved by studying the Divine Comedy and its movement toward a goal. I think we must have a kind of ultimate transcendent goal. I just can't get away from that idea that we're destined for something beyond just living our years out here on this planet.
Yeah. You, when I read your book, The Mystery of Transformation, your chapter on Dante's Divine Comedy, that was the most, I enjoyed that chapter the most. Yeah. And so, with that, thank you very much. Where can people find you? Are you working on any new books? Anything like that?
Well, I'm putting together a collected writings, and I'm working on volume 7 now. Volume 5 and 6. 6 has been published. 5 will be published in a couple of months. I'm working on 7. I think there will be 10, probably, or so finally. And I'm also working on writing some plays with a friend of mine, a Jewish friend of mine in Israel. And
cool.
We've written one and performed it. We're now in the final phases of preparing number 2, and we're thinking about number 3. So that's been a lot of fun. I have a website that's now it's under reconstruction, but you can find all this, books and so on, information on my website, murraystein.com.
Okay, thank you. I'll link that in the description. The plays, are they going to be broadcasted anywhere or written or published?
Yes, the first one has been published. It's called The Analyst and the Rabbi.
Oh, cool.
It's published by Chiron Publications, and we did make a film version of it. I think it's on YouTube.
Okay.
And we'll publish the others in time as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, good sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, Daniel. Nice talking to you.